Ja järgmine arutelu toimub selleks, et oleks natuke sujuvam inglise keeles, kuna üks osapool räägib inglise keelt. Ja nii, et kellel on vaja tõlget, võtke kõrvaklapid. Kogu aeg võite küsida, juhul kui muidugi arutlejad siin lava peal väga hoogu satuvad, siis me küsimusi vahele ei lase, aga kui tekib väike vaikus, siis torgake, aidake kaasa. Ja ma natuke nüüd tutvustaks siis neid, kes osalevad. Et ühte osalejat väga palju tutvustama ei pea, Jürgen Ligi on tema nimi. Jürgen, 2 aastat tagasi, kui see konverents toimus, siis oli Jürgen Riigikogu rahanduskomisjoni esimees, nii et mingi jälje ta rahandusmaailma oli jätnud, aga keegi ei osanud sel ajal veel arvata, kui suur krokodill selle kivi all peidus on. Tänapäeval põhimõtteliselt Jürgen nagu erilist tutvustust ei vaja selles suhtes. Ja teine esineja on meil siis ingliskeelne ja tegemist on Andrew Wardiga, kes võib-olla kelle pärast ma lähengi nüüd kohe üle inglise keelele. Andrew, Jürgen, maybe you join me on the stage. I don't need to introduce Jürgen very much for this audience, Andrew, because everybody knows him. Tulge siia, come here. Everybody knows him in Estonia. His nickname is Crocodile. And maybe you're a little bit surprised that we give nicknames like Crocodile to people that we appreciate. But as we don't know so much about you, maybe you give us just short overview of yourself. Who are you? What are you doing? And then we go on from this point.
Is this working? Yeah.
Yeah. Please sit down.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Andrew Ward, and I'm the Nordic and Baltic Bureau Chief for the Financial Times newspaper based in Stockholm. And I often joke that this involves the biggest geographical region of anyone in the Financial Times, because it stretches from Greenland in the west to, all the way to Estonia and Finland in the east. So I've been following the Baltic economies very closely on behalf of the Financial Times. Previously worked in Washington, D.C., and also in South Korea, in Seoul, South Korea. So I'm British, but have been outside the UK for the past 10 years.
Okay, I understand. You have been following Estonia, you have been following Europe, and maybe we can start with the discussion about what will happen with Europe. We all know that many countries in Europe have used to live over actually their incomes. And now they are in trouble, but the question is how deep will that trouble be in the future? What do you think?
Do you want me to start? Yeah, I mean, I think there was a tendency maybe a few months ago to talk about the financial crisis in the past tense, that the financial crisis was something that happened in September 2008 when Lehman Brothers collapsed and Iceland collapsed. We thought we were out of the woods. It's now clear that the Eurozone debt crisis is a continuation of an ongoing financial crisis. We can debate the causes. Partly it's to do with recklessness and excessive spending, excessive borrowing, but there's also clearly structural challenges to overcome within the Eurozone. You had a period of relatively low growth among the big core Eurozone economies, faster growth in the less advanced peripheral economies of the Eurozone, low interest rates, all of that naturally funneled capital and investment to the peripheries, and that obviously has contributed to the crisis we see now. And of course this will be a challenge for Estonia in future, but perhaps we can get into those issues in our discussion. But we were discussing before, we were thinking that maybe we would also start from the sort of broader perspective, not just of what's going on now, but to look back over the past decade. There is a real sense that we are in a moment of historic change in the global economy, perhaps the most momentous change since the rise of the US economy at the beginning of the 19th century. I think that next year China is projected to become the biggest manufacturer in the world by value. And that would be, I think, only the third time that title has changed position among countries in 250 years. So it's a historic moment. And if you go back if you just go back 10 years, we had a book, I remember, by a historian called Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book called The End of History, which argued that Western liberal democracy had triumphed, and therefore it was the end of history. And this, looking back now, we see clearly that this was a peak of Western power, both economically and militarily. But there was this assumption that markets and democracy went hand in hand, and that the West, led by the US, would always be the natural winners from that globalization game. I think over the past decade we've clearly seen that argument demolished as we see rising emerging markets starting to look like perhaps they're winning the game of globalization. So there would be just a few of my opening thoughts that perhaps we can explore in more detail.
Jürgen, do you have something?
I have something. To be honest, we didn't plan this debate, but we discovered sitting here that we both would like to start with history. And the question was where the prosperity goes to and what will happen, what happens to Europe. First, I must say that Europe is doing very well. Europe is the best place to live. It's secure, it's wealthy, and if we take a million years perspective, then a lot of prosperity has come here, and if we take 200 years perspective, then we may say that again Europe has become much wealthier comparatively. There are some estimation which say that 200 years ago GDP of Asia was twice as big as today's advanced world, that is together with Japan, and now it's vice versa. Advanced world gives twice the GDP of Asia without Japan, and of course Europe is inside the advanced world. So we can say that Europe is growing very quickly. Among other advanced world, it simply depends how big part of the curve we take as a tendency. During a generation, of course, Asia has been doing much better, and there is huge pressure by China, first of all. At the same time, development of Japan's prosperity has almost stopped. So the things are changing very quickly, and the South Korea is another success story. This is something. The history is something that helps us to think what are the growth models during one generation in the future. I believe. I do not want to make projections a million years ahead, but one generation would be good. And talking about this model with the help of you, maybe we can project DAS, China necessarily, and Asia passes advanced world and will dominate.
The history is, it's important to have this perspective because and we must never lose sight of how often we've been wrong in the past. Because you mentioned Japan, and of course, I mentioned how 10 years ago, at the end of the 90s and the beginning of this decade, it perhaps seemed that liberal democracy had triumphed and the West was set for sort of endless dominance. A decade before that, of course, there was great fretting in the US that Japan was going to overtake it as the world's biggest economy. And then very soon after, those fears subsided and Japan had its lost decade. So we shouldn't underestimate the risks to the growth facing China and India and other emerging markets as they try to catch up. Clearly they have tremendous potential, but it's not going to be without its setbacks along the way. I was looking at some figures. 150 million people in China still live on less than $2 a day. Chinese GDP per capita is still only a fifth of the US. So there's still a long way to go. And of course, when you look at, we were talking before about the capital inflows into China, and it's clear that they've got a big challenge to keep their economy from, they've had challenges preventing it overheating. There has to be question marks, concerns over whether you could have financial crises in China in due course when you look at the level of domestic investment in infrastructure and the lending by domestic banks. There are clearly financial risks within China itself. So I don't think this is going to be one endless decline by the West and an endless rise by China. There's going to be setbacks, and it's not guaranteed that China is necessarily going to fulfill all of the potential that we talk about at the moment. And then you have India in the mix as well, of course, and there's some India enthusiasts who like to recite the story of the tortoise and the hare. Are you familiar with this tortoise and hare story in Estonia? This is a tortoise, a turtle, has a race with a hare. Of course, the hare is much quicker than the tortoise. But when the hare sees how far ahead it is, it takes a nap beside the road, and the tortoise ends up winning the race.
Of course.
And there are some people who believe that actually we're looking at getting excited about the wrong emerging market, and that India, with its democracy, its legal system, could end up the ultimate winner, because perhaps you might argue it has fewer of the political risks and perhaps fewer of the challenges that China has of keeping its nation together and keeping its growth on track. So let's not just focus on China.
Still, another thing that I noticed when Mary held her presentation here, that regarding this R&D expenditure in percentage, Sweden was leading, wasn't it? United States was second. I didn't see China at all on that picture, on that slide. Where is China?
This is a question whether you can pass those who you are mostly copying. That is what is the growth potential of economies who have mainly cheap labor and general costs. The growth, the long-term potential of growth probably for economies, if we don't stop on environmental growth, environmental constraints, which have played very big part in the history and will be played even bigger globally, and are playing already, and are playing actually in China, to my mind. Then it is the ability of a society to attract and keep capital and human capital, and to make them cooperate in the best way. And talking about Europe, this is a big advantage here. The level of human capital is extremely high. The ability to work with capital to cooperate is very good, and this has helped Europe to develop within a couple of decades quicker than other regions and most of the regions of the world. And talking about, if you talk about capital, this has become extremely mobile, which wasn't the case in the past. Money and capital goods can swift very quickly from one part of the world to another. So attracting capital is a very crucial element of growth. And human, that is labor, is another factor which is becoming more and more mobile and can also move to one place and another to another, and keeping good people in the country is a very critical issue, to keep and attract capital and to keep and attract people and to make them work together. And what are the advantages here for Europe and I believe to Estonia in general? They can be characterized as maybe through democracy. That is, liberal democracy has created the highest level of prosperity the world has ever seen, and there is no signs that other models are stronger, though in the short term they have been developing quicker. I would say they have been developing, copying, and using the centrums of ideas and capital, like Europe, like America.
Yeah, I would agree with that all is definitely not lost, and there are still many great assets in Europe. One way to look at what's happening, one way to sort of interpret this seismic shift that's going on is that it doesn't necessarily have to, it's not necessarily a zero-sum game where the East rises and the West falls. You could, going back to the history point, many in China see their growth as a sort of natural resurgence, because in history, and China views history in the thousands of years rather than the decades or even the centuries. They've always been an economic power, and so they see the past 100 years as an aberration from which they are now escaping. But again, that doesn't have to mean that it's a zero-sum game where we are the losers. You can see this as perhaps a return to something approaching normality. It's a natural rebalancing. And probably the core issue at the heart of the financial crisis of the past couple of years is this imbalance in the global economy, where the US and Europe, to an extent, was living beyond their means, living this credit-fueled lifestyle on the back of cheap imports from China, while China saved the proceeds and accumulated these huge foreign currency reserves as a consequence. And obviously rebalancing, finding a better balance is one of the biggest challenges facing the global economy right now. So perhaps this process could ultimately turn out to be a sort of healthy rebalancing. And if I'm from the UK, we've been in relative decline for a century. We were once the guys that were the top trading and military power in the world. We've been in decline for 100 years, and yet still Britain is a wealthy, advanced country. So relative decline doesn't mean the end. And I saw one statistic that puts this in perspective. By the time China is the size, the Chinese economy is the size of the US economy, according to current estimates, the world economy will have tripled from its current size to $150 trillion. So I guess that's more than enough to go around. And if you're not competitive enough to get a decent slice of 150 trillion, then it might be, it's probably your fault.
But it's interesting that you touched the UK already, because we got one question from audience. I don't know whom I should address that to, you as a UK person, or to you as a champion of cutting budget in Europe. recently awarded. But the question is, why we speak only about budget deficit and financial crisis in Eurozone? Why not to talk about UK and the crisis for UK pound? When will that appear? Who wants to start? Andrew?
Remember, I haven't lived there for 10 years and I don't pay UK taxes, so I don't have an immediate stake in the game. But yeah, I mean, the UK has a big has a deficit comparable with the most crisis-hit Eurozone countries. That's true. We also had a crisis in our domestic banking sector. You know, if you were a Eurosceptic, as many people are in the UK, they would argue that it's been an advantage subsequently not to be part of the Eurozone because it's allowed our economy to recover quite nicely because the pound has depreciated quite a bit. But, you know, I think that the UK has taken a different approach to the US. The US has been much more hesitant about austerity measures, whereas the UK has been very aggressive. And so I think these are you know, two economies that came into the financial crisis with similar models. They were the two sort of standard bearers for Anglo-Saxon open market financial sector-led capitalism. They're coming out of the crisis with rather different remedies, where the UK is much more willing to cut. The US has been more hesitant about doing that, and we'll see which is the better model.
Jürgen?
Well, this model of competing devaluations is something what Euro is about. It's the idea is to stop this kind of competition. So I'm not happy about that kind of growth model. But talking about Great Britain, it's doing much better after the elections. They are getting their public finances in much better order now and doing right things. But they should also join Eurozone, I believe. This would be only honest. Though not useful in every stages of economic cycle, let's say this way. But looking in this room, everybody here likes to live in Europe, and there are very many reasons for that. That is, I mentioned security of the environment. General prosperity, of course, is an issue. I would say it's good education. It's good infrastructure, it's strong institutions, it's good governance, it's rule of law, democracy, and finally it's, of course, a good place to do business. This is everything that supports economic development in the long run. And though that's why I'm not too pessimistic about the European future. At the same time, there are real threats here. Why Estonia, for example, who hasn't reached the average level and is even not among the fifth richest European countries yet, should be careful in copying. That is, European model has built up too much on deficits. It hasn't taken into account aging problems, and so taking its competitive situation here, we can't be sure that Europe comes out of the next 2 decades as a winner. Looking in the future, we have to take into account that European taxes tend to increase, that there is a huge pressure to cut at the same time costs and the level of public services, and this is something that doesn't help for sure Europe. And in short, our challenge here is to, in Europe and Estonia among others, is of course to increase growth potential and productivity.
I think, some of the greatest challenges facing both Europe and the US are political at heart as much as economic. If you look at the riots that have been in various parts of Europe, most recently in my country, we had riots against increased student tuition fees. We've seen riots in France against fairly modest pension reforms. So in Europe, the resistance tends to be towards cuts in public benefits. Go across the Atlantic and look at the Tea Party movement, this grassroots conservative movement that is becoming increasingly influential in the Republican Party. They are supposedly against deficits. They're supposedly in favour of small government, but of course they don't want tax rises. They would be opposed to anything that involved a tax rise, and yet clearly tax rises are going to need to be part of the US solution as well. And you see now the Republicans having taken control of at least part of Congress. You potentially have political gridlock there, and we have, you might argue, political gridlock on some of these issues in Europe. So I think that the big challenge is going to be the politics of this for Europe and the US.
Any questions from audience? If not, I have one last. Let us finish in optimistic mode. Could you comment with a few words, Van Rompuy's statement that we are in survival crisis? If that is optimistic.
Is that supposed to encourage an optimistic comment? I don't know if you have an immediate thought. There was one thing that I wanted to mention, and that was a story in the UK a couple of weeks ago where a Chinese vase, you may have seen this in the headlines, a Chinese vase that had been stuck on somebody's bookshelf for decades in a little house. A modest family in London had this Chinese vase. It was a book stop. It was holding up books. And I think it was a family member who died, and the surviving relatives took to get it valued. And the expert said it looks pretty valuable. So they had it auctioned, and it sold a couple of weeks ago for a record price of, I think, £53 million. This is the most expensive ever piece of porcelain or whatever it was to be sold. So the point I'm making is that this was a very vivid demonstration of the shifting powers we've been talking about. It was an illustration of the rising financial might of China. They're coming over here, they're buying up these antiques at these crazy prices. But I think it's also a cautionary note as well, because it strikes me as a potential warning sign of hubris. And I think that's what the biggest message from the financial crisis is, to avoid hubris. We never understand the economy as much as we think. We're never as smart as we think we are. And there's a lot of people in other parts of the world, other than Europe and the US, who are looking pretty smart at the moment. I bet they're probably not as smart as they look at the moment, and that there'll be more crises in future, and we won't always be the losers.
Jürgen, last statement.
I remember the exact context of Van Rompuy's announcement. It was probably the question of survival of Eurozone and Europe because of the short-term crisis of Europe, but financial crisis or debt crisis, sovereign debt crisis. He is of course right that there is a hard battle here. In the short run, the problems are easier. That is, it's possible to cut the budget to be brave to be committed, but in the long run, it's the biggest challenge is still structural reforms for Europe and productivity. That is talking about structural reforms. That is, of course, public finances. It's pension reform. It's labor market reform. It's such issues which take time, but can't be avoided. And Estonia is not the worst example here, but still we also have a lot to do. I agree with Van Rompuy, but his words describe the long-run situation even better than the short run.
Okay, anyhow, this £53 million way sounded better than Rompuy's statement, I must say. But thank you very much for joining us here, for sharing your thoughts, and as a memory of today's conference, book and the last Estonian Kvarna.
Wow, that's really something. Thank
Keep
you very
it.
much.
Maybe after 200 years it could be sold for many millions.
I think this could see a little bit of inflation. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Jürgen.
I hope to see a pound in the similar box. And I also say that I was not among those who gave birth to krone, but I am among those who are killing it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.